So this week we're going to cover chapter 2, which is about preferences. So if you remember last week, we kind of talked about, this first part of the course is about consumer theory, or consumer behavior. And so that's the idea that consumers are kind of going to pick the best bundle of goods that they can afford. So last week we looked at the budget constraint. And we understood that people's choices were constrained by their resources. Resources being, time or money are the kind of two classic resources we might think about. So we kind of talked about what bundles people could afford last week. Well, now we're going to start adding to the other part of that theory where people are picking the best bundle they can afford. So how do we think about, modeling people's preferences in terms of what bundles they prefer? So that's what we're going to do this week. So let's just write that out, and then we can get into the material in the next video. So last chapter, we discussed how consumers behave. And this is the idea that they pick the best bundle they can afford. Last chapter, is when we talked about they can afford part through that budget constraint. This chapter, and really the next one as well when we get to utility, but here's where we're going to start thinking about the best bundle. How can we model people's preferences for different goods? So just as a reminder before we kind of get into the material, that a consumption bundle remember, like a capital X, it's kind of like a vector, or it kind of gave you the different combinations of the goods, or the different number of goods that we're consuming, right? So this capital X equals X1 and X2. If we just had two goods, X1 is the amount of good 1, and X2 is the amount of good 2. And so, what these two goods are is going to depend on the situation, and a lot of times we could have, n different goods if we wanted to make it really, really general. We're going to talk about usually two goods is enough, especially if we use like a composite good, right? Where one of, X1 is this good we're really interested in, and maybe X2 is like all other goods. All right, so we're going to get started by talking about preferences, but just remember what these consumption bundles are, because we're going to be discussing them a lot when we think about preferences.